What if the story of humanity is not missing a few pages, but entire volumes, quietly removed, carefully forgotten, or gently buried beneath more convenient truths? As we drift through the familiar names and dates of recorded history, there is a strange sense that something vast has slipped through the cracks, leaving only echoes in stone, myth, and memory. Tonight is not about certainty. It is about absence, about the soft unease that arises when patterns repeat too perfectly to be coincidence. So before you settle too deeply into comfort, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if what I'm offering here truly resonates with you, and share your location and local time in the comments. Then, together with Historic Sleep, let us continue forward, listening closely to the silence between civilizations, where forgotten worlds may still be whispering. The contradiction appears quietly, almost politely, in the margins of what we are taught to accept as human history. Civilization, we are told, advances in a straight line, stone to bronze, bronze to iron, huts to cities, fire to electricity, chaos to order. And yet, when examined closely, the line bends, it frays. In some places it vanishes altogether. Entire chapters seem to have been smoothed over, as if the story we inherited was edited for simplicity rather than accuracy. The deeper one looks, the more uncomfortable the question becomes. What if civilization does not rise once, but many times, only to fall back into shadow? Across geology, archaeology, and ancient chronology, there is a recurring discomfort with depth. Not depth of soil alone, but depth of time. Human presence is supposed to be shallow, recent, fragile. Our species, in the official telling, stumbles into awareness only a few thousand years ago, clumsy and experimental, slowly discovering principles that now feel inevitable. But the Earth itself does not seem to cooperate with this narrative. Layers of sediment accumulate far faster than expected. Landscapes show signs of sudden burial rather than gradual decay. And beneath cities thought to be young, there are foundations that do not align with the cultures credited for building them. This is where the idea of cycles begins to surface. Not as mythology, not as metaphor, but as a structural possibility. In nature, cycles dominate everything. Climate, ecosystems, magnetic poles, even stars. Stability is temporary. Collapse is not an anomaly, it is a phase. And yet human civilization is often portrayed as an exception to this rule, as if culture somehow escaped the rhythms governing the planet that hosts it. The assumption is subtle but powerful, that once intelligence reaches a certain threshold, it no longer resets, it only accumulates. But evidence, scattered and inconvenient, hints otherwise. There are moments in the archaeological record where progress appears abruptly, fully formed, without a clear developmental trail. Sophisticated stonework emerges with no visible apprenticeship. Precise astronomical alignments appear in societies labelled primitive. Techniques that require long experimentation arrive suddenly, then disappear just as quickly, leaving later cultures to rediscover them as if for the first time. These are not isolated curiosities. They form a pattern that is rarely addressed directly, perhaps because acknowledging it would force a reconsideration of humanity's place in time. Ancient traditions, when stripped of their symbolic language, often describe worlds before the world. Not a single golden age, but multiple eras separated by catastrophe. Floods, fires, darkness, silence. These stories are usually classified as myth, safely distanced from history. Yet the consistency is unsettling. Cultures separated by oceans and millennia describe similar sequences: a flourishing age, a collapse, survivors, rebuilding. What varies are the names and metaphors. What remains constant is the rhythm. Modern scholarship tends to compress these accounts, interpreting them as exaggerated memories of local disasters. But compression itself may be the problem. By forcing all ancient memory into a narrow window, we lose the ability to see repetition. A single flood is manageable. Multiple floods across deep time suggest a cycle, and cycles suggest that what we call our civilization may not be unique, but merely the latest iteration. This is where the notion of a seventh civilization begins to take shape, not as a claim, but as a question. If collapses have occurred before, how many times have they happened? How many peaks have risen, flourished, and been erased so thoroughly that only faint impressions remain? The number itself is less important than the implication, that we are not standing at the summit of history but somewhere along a recurring path. One reason this idea feels so destabilizing is psychological. To believe we are the first is comforting. It places us at the center of meaning. It turns progress into destiny. But if others came before us, others who built, measured, understood, and then vanished, then our achievements are no longer final. They are temporary, and so are we. There is also a practical resistance. A cyclical model of civilization introduces uncomfortable responsibilities. If collapse is not hypothetical but historical, then it can happen again. If knowledge has been lost before, then preservation becomes urgent rather than ceremonial. Institutions built on permanence begin to look fragile. Narratives built on inevitability begin to wobble, and yet the signs persist. Inconsistencies in timelines, technologies appearing without clear origin stories, cultural memory that behaves less like invention and more like inheritance. Even language itself carries fossils, concepts embedded in words that seem older than the societies using them. It is as if fragments of previous worlds were absorbed unconsciously, repurposed without recognition, passed forward as instinct rather than record. This does not require imagining advanced machines or fantastical powers. A civilization does not need to resemble ours to be sophisticated. Knowledge can take many forms: astronomical, acoustic, architectural, symbolic. What matters is not how similar they were to us, but how thoroughly they were removed. Total erasure leaves only anomalies, and anomalies, when isolated, are easy to dismiss. When connected, they begin to speak. Perhaps the greatest erasure is not physical, but conceptual. By defining civilization as a single, linear ascent, we make all other possibilities invisible. We stop asking whether we are latecomers. We stop listening for echoes. We stop noticing that the ground beneath us is layered with more stories than we are comfortable acknowledging. As this journey continues, the question is not whether we can prove the existence of multiple civilizations beyond doubt. Proof, in the strict sense, may never arrive. The question is whether the official narrative explains the evidence better than the alternative, and whether silence, repetition, and contradiction are truly signs of randomness, or the residue of something deliberately or naturally reset. If we are living in the seventh civilization, then history is not a straight road stretching behind us, but a circle, worn smooth by countless footsteps. The unsettling thought is not that others came before us. It is that they once believed just as confidently that nothing had come before them at all. What unsettles the narrative further is not only what is missing from human history, but how abruptly the natural world seems to intervene. If civilization were a steady, cumulative process, the planet itself would need to behave predictably, offering long, gentle slopes of change. Instead, the Earth records something else entirely. Its memory, written in ice cores, ocean sediments, and fractured rock, speaks in interruptions, sudden shifts, moments where continuity breaks, not gradually, but decisively. Geology does not tell a story of patience. It tells a story of thresholds. Temperatures remain stable for centuries, then plunge. Sea levels hold, then rise violently. Ecosystems flourish, then vanish. These are not rare exceptions spaced safely apart by millions of years. Many occur within the span of human memory, or just beyond it, and when these disruptions are placed beside the fragile structures of civilization, the question becomes unavoidable. How many worlds ended without leaving survivors capable of preserving their story? One of the most uncomfortable realizations emerges when extinction-level thinking is scaled down. Popular imagination associates global catastrophe with dinosaurs and asteroids, with events so massive they feel abstract. But civilization does not require extinction to collapse. It requires only disruption, crop failure, climate instability, loss of centralized knowledge, fragmentation of communication. A society can lose its coherence long before it loses its people. And when that happens, knowledge does not vanish dramatically. It thins, it distorts, it retreats into fragments. Throughout the geological record, there are signatures of rapid environmental change that coincide uncomfortably with periods of human development, sudden cooling events, massive floods, volcanic winters. These are often framed as challenges that early humans overcame, reinforcing the heroic arc of progress. But what if they were not merely challenges? What if some were endings? What if each reset left behind survivors who rebuilt with diminished tools, carrying memories they could not fully translate into action? This is where the idea of repetition gains weight. A single catastrophe can be explained away. A sequence of them begins to resemble a mechanism. Ice ages advance and retreat. Shorelines migrate miles inland, then withdraw. Entire regions become uninhabitable within a generation. When these cycles are acknowledged in climate science but disconnected from cultural history, a gap opens, a space where lost civilizations could exist without violating known physics or biology. Consider sediment. Cities are expected to decay upward. Walls crumble, roofs fall, structures flatten into ruins. But in many places what we find instead is burial. Thick layers of soil covering built environments, sometimes uniformly, sometimes abruptly. The explanation is often gradual accumulation over centuries, yet the rate implied by these layers does not always align with observed processes. In some cases, the volume of material suggests rapid deposition, as if landscapes were overwhelmed rather than gently forgotten. This matters because burial preserves. A city destroyed by fire or war leaves traces visible to later builders. A city buried by flood or mud can disappear almost completely, becoming invisible to memory as well as to sight. Its stones become foundations for new structures. Its streets become basements. Its existence reduced to anomalies that seem out of place in a linear timeline. The official narrative tends to isolate these events. A flood here, a cold snap there, a volcanic eruption somewhere else. But isolation prevents pattern recognition. When these disruptions are viewed collectively, across continents and millennia, they begin to resemble pulses rather than accidents. The Earth breathes in catastrophe, exhales calm and repeats. Human history, however, is often written as though it unfolds independently of these rhythms. Civilizations rise and fall due to politics, economics, or moral decay, while the planet remains a passive stage. Yet archaeology repeatedly shows societies flourishing in stable climates and struggling or vanishing when those conditions change abruptly. It is not difficult to imagine entire networks of knowledge collapsing when the environment they depended on disappeared. There is also the question of timing. Some geological events occur so rapidly that they would overwhelm any attempt at adaptation. A sudden shift in rainfall patterns can transform fertile land into desert within decades. Coastal cities can be swallowed by rising seas faster than they can retreat. In such scenarios, survival becomes local and improvised. Writing, long-distance trade, and centralized archives are luxuries that vanish first. If such events occurred repeatedly, it would explain something deeply puzzling. Why humanity appears to reinvent the same tools, the same social structures, the same insights again and again. Agriculture emerges, disappears, and re-emerges. Monumental architecture appears fully developed, then ceases, then reappears elsewhere. It is as if each civilization inherits only the faintest outline of what came before, enough to guide intuition, not enough to preserve certainty. This perspective does not require imagining a single apocalyptic moment that erased everything. Instead, it suggests a series of partial erasures, each reset incomplete, each collapse leaving survivors who carried forward fragments without context. Over time, those fragments would be mythologized, simplified, or misunderstood. Knowledge would survive as story long after its practical meaning was lost. The Earth itself becomes an unreliable archivist. Erosion destroys, sedimentation hides, tectonic movement distorts. What remains visible is not representative of what once existed, but of what happened to endure. Absence, therefore, is not proof of non-existence. It is often evidence of forces too large to leave neat traces. As this idea settles, a quiet unease emerges. If geological instability has repeatedly intersected with human development, then civilization is not a march forward, but a negotiation with forces beyond control. Progress becomes temporary, memory becomes fragile, and the possibility that we are living after several forgotten endings no longer feels speculative, but disturbingly plausible. The deeper implication is not simply that others were erased, but that we may be standing on similar ground. The same planet that reset the past continues its cycles without regard for narratives or belief. And if history has been interrupted before by the Earth itself, the silence between those interruptions may hold more truth than the stories we tell to fill it. What complicates the picture even further is time itself, not the passing of days or years, but the way deep time is measured, compressed, and quietly negotiated. When ancient civilizations attempted to record their own origins, they did not think in the narrow spans we now prefer. Their chronologies stretch backward uncomfortably far, describing reigns that last thousands of years, ages that unfold over epochs rather than generations. Modern interpretation often responds by trimming these accounts down, translating vast durations into symbolic language, or dismissing them as mythic exaggeration. But this act of compression may be less about accuracy and more about discomfort. Because long timelines raise an awkward possibility. If early cultures believed they were inheriting a world already ancient, then the idea that civilization began recently becomes increasingly fragile. Some of the oldest historical records do not describe beginnings at all. They describe aftermaths. They speak of restoration, renewal, and rebuilding, as if the authors were standing on the ruins of something older, trying to make sense of what survived. Ancient king lists are a case in point. In several early cultures, the sequence of rulers is divided sharply into two categories: those who reigned before a great disruption and those who ruled after. The first group is often assigned extraordinarily long reigns, spanning centuries or millennia. This is typically explained away as symbolic storytelling, a way of honouring ancestral figures. Yet what if the symbolism masks something more literal? Not individual lifespans, but extended eras remembered as unified wholes. When modern historians compress these eras into a few generations, the continuity becomes manageable. But something is lost in the process, the sense that time itself behaved differently before a rupture, the sense that history did not simply begin but resumed. Calendars tell a similar story. Many ancient systems track time across immense cycles, far exceeding practical agricultural needs. These are not the calendars of people preoccupied only with harvests and seasons. They are the calendars of observers who think in terms of recurrence, of worlds repeating their patterns over vast intervals. The question is not why such systems exist, but why we are so eager to detach them from lived experience. Even within accepted historical frameworks, there are strange inconsistencies. Civilizations appear suddenly with fully developed administrative systems, legal codes, and cosmologies. Writing emerges not as a tentative experiment, but as a refined tool already capable of abstraction and nuance. Mathematics arrives not as trial and error, but as structured knowledge. The expected long apprenticeship is often missing. This absence is usually explained by lost records, but lost records themselves demand explanation. Why would the earliest, most formative stages of civilization consistently fail to survive, while later, supposedly more chaotic periods leave clearer traces? The pattern repeats often enough to suggest that something more systematic may be at work. One possibility is that timekeeping itself was disrupted. Catastrophic events do not simply destroy cities, they fracture chronology. When centralized institutions collapse, calendars reset. Dating systems restart from symbolic moments. A flood, a founding, a divine intervention. Over generations, these resets accumulate. What was once a continuation becomes remembered as an origin. This is how deep history can be folded into shallow timelines without obvious falsification. Each reset erases context while preserving fragments. Names survive, but meanings drift. Numbers remain, but scales shrink. What was once a reference to an age becomes interpreted as a metaphor. What was once a measurement becomes a story. There is also the issue of selective survival. Organic materials decay, metals corrode, knowledge stored in fragile media vanishes quickly when conditions change. What endures best is stone, alignment, and pattern. Architecture outlasts language. Orientation outlasts inscription. A building can survive its builders long after their names are forgotten. This may explain why ancient structures often appear older than their recorded histories. The official dates may reflect the most recent restoration rather than the original construction. Over time, layers of rebuilding obscure origins and later cultures inherit monuments without inheriting the knowledge that created them. They adapt, reinterpret, and eventually claim authorship. Not out of deception, but necessity. Time, in this sense, becomes palimpsest rather than record. Each civilization writes over the last, leaving traces beneath the surface. When we dig, we do not find a clean sequence but interference patterns, overlapping eras, contradictory dates, structures that seem to belong to no one. Modern chronology tries to resolve these contradictions by smoothing them out. Inconsistencies are averaged, outliers are excluded. The result is a timeline that appears coherent, but only because it has been curated. What does not fit is labelled anomalous, then quietly sidelined. Yet anomalies persist. They appear in the form of dates that refuse to align, artifacts that seem too advanced or too early, records that describe time spans far beyond accepted limits. Each one, taken alone, can be dismissed. Together, they suggest a deeper problem, that our model of time may be too small for the evidence it is meant to contain. If civilization has risen and fallen multiple times, then each cycle would inherit a distorted sense of the past. Survivors would know that something existed before, but not how far back it truly went. Over generations, deep time would collapse into myth, and myth would collapse into footnote. This raises a quiet but unsettling possibility. Perhaps we do not lack evidence of earlier civilizations because they did not exist. Perhaps we lack it because time itself has been repeatedly folded, compressed by catastrophe and reconstruction, until only a thin slice remains visible. If that is true, then the oldest dates we accept may not mark beginnings at all. They may mark the most recent moment when memory restarted. Everything before that lies not beyond history but beneath it, buried under layers of reinterpretation, waiting for a framework willing to see time not as a line, but as a series of interrupted continuities. And if our own civilization were to collapse, it would leave behind similar distortions. Future survivors might remember us not as we were, but as fragments allow. Our centuries could become legends. Our timelines could shrink. Our endings could be rewritten as origins. Time would not disappear. It would simply reset its count once again. There is a quiet tension embedded in stone, one that becomes apparent only when buildings are examined not as symbols, but as evidence. Architecture, unlike texts, does not easily lie. It resists reinterpretation. Measurements remain precise. Angles remain fixed. Loads either transfer correctly or they do not. And it is here, in the physical logic of ancient structures, that the official timeline begins to strain. Across the world, there are buildings attributed to early civilizations that display an understanding of engineering far beyond what their supposed developmental stage would suggest. Stones weighing tens or hundreds of tons are placed with tolerances that modern construction still struggles to replicate. Foundations are levelled across uneven terrain with astonishing accuracy. Walls align to astronomical events that require long-term observation and mathematical abstraction. These are not accidental achievements. They imply accumulated knowledge, refined over time. Yet the cultures credited with these works are often described as newly emerged, barely removed from subsistence living. The contradiction is subtle but persistent. If these societies were still discovering basic tools, where did such precision come from? The usual answer is ingenuity, a sudden flowering of brilliance. But brilliance, while real, does not replace infrastructure. Knowledge of this kind is rarely spontaneous. It is inherited, tested, corrected, and passed down. This becomes more troubling when architectural styles appear without clear ancestors. Monumental construction arrives fully formed, then declines or disappears. Later cultures imitate the style but cannot reproduce its quality. Stones become smaller, alignments less precise, techniques simplify. The trajectory moves backward before moving forward again elsewhere, as if the knowledge necessary for such construction had been lost and partially remembered. In some cases, the buildings themselves appear older than the civilizations that claim them. Layers of renovation obscure original cores. Decorative elements differ from structural ones. The visible surface tells one story, while the buried foundation tells another. When dates are assigned, they often reflect the latest occupation rather than the initial design. Over time, reuse becomes mistaken for origin. This pattern raises an uncomfortable possibility, that many ancient societies were not inventing architecture but inheriting it. They arrived at sites already prepared, platforms already levelled, foundations already laid, and adapted them to their own needs. Temples replaced older temples. Cities rose atop earlier cities. Each layer claimed continuity, while quietly erasing evidence of what came before. The idea of inherited architecture is not fringe. Archaeology openly acknowledges that sites are reused. What is rarely explored is the implication of scale. If foundational knowledge was inherited, then the true builders may predate recorded history by far more than is currently accepted. Their absence from the narrative becomes not an oversight, but a structural blind spot. Stonework offers another clue. In many ancient sites, the oldest sections are the most refined. Later additions are cruder, less precise, more decorative than functional. This inversion defies the expected progression of skill. One would anticipate early work to be rough, improving over time. Instead, perfection appears first, followed by decline. The explanation is often symbolic. Early builders are credited with exceptional craftsmanship due to cultural priorities. Later generations, it is said, simply valued aesthetics over precision. But this explanation falters when the early precision serves no obvious symbolic purpose. Hidden joints, load-bearing angles concealed beneath decoration, techniques invisible to casual observers. These are choices made by engineers, not artists. Orientation deepens the mystery. Many ancient structures are aligned to solstices, equinoxes, or stellar events with remarkable accuracy. Achieving this requires not only observation, but records, years, sometimes centuries of consistent tracking. It assumes stability across generations. A culture struggling to establish itself would have little opportunity to develop such long-term data sets. An inherited observational tradition, however, would make it possible. If architectural knowledge was passed forward through collapse, it would not survive intact. Techniques would fragment. Some principles would endure. Others would be misunderstood. Later builders might replicate forms without grasping function. Over time, the architecture would become symbolic of knowledge rather than an expression of it. This process would explain why some ancient monuments seem excessive for their stated purpose. Why build with such durability for a simple ritual? Why align with such precision if the meaning is forgotten? The structure may have once served a function no longer remembered, repurposed by cultures who inherited the shell but not the intent. Modern classification struggles with this ambiguity. Buildings must be assigned dates. Dates must align with cultural phases. When evidence does not fit, it is adjusted. A structure becomes ceremonial rather than functional. An engineering feature becomes symbolic. The architecture is interpreted until it conforms to expectation. But stone does not adjust itself to theory. It remains where it is, doing what it does, supporting weight, channeling force, marking time. Its logic persists even when explanations change. This is where the idea of lost cycles becomes tangible. If civilizations rise, collapse, and rise again, architecture would act as a bridge between eras. Not all knowledge would vanish. Some would be embedded physically into the landscape. Future societies would encounter it without context, inheriting capability without comprehension. Over generations, the origin of such structures would fade. Stories would replace records. Builders would become gods, giants, or mythical ancestors. Eventually, the architecture would be absorbed into a new narrative, claimed as the achievement of the current civilization, its deeper history buried beneath pride or necessity. The unsettling implication is that we may be misattributing some of humanity's greatest architectural achievements. Not because of deception, but because the true builders exist outside the compressed timelines we are comfortable acknowledging. Their absence is not proof of non-existence, it is evidence of erasure. As this pattern repeats across continents, the question becomes hard to avoid. Are these buildings anomalies within our history, or remnants of histories we have not yet learned how to see? And if so, how many layers of inheritance are we standing on, mistaking endurance for origin? Architecture does not speak, but it remembers, and what it remembers may not belong to us at all. There is a strange consistency to humanity's oldest stories, one that becomes harder to ignore the more cultures are placed side by side. Long before global communication, before shared languages or trade routes spanning oceans, people separated by vast distances told remarkably similar tales, not just of gods or heroes, but of endings, of worlds undone, of water rising, fire falling, skies darkening, and memory breaking apart. These stories are usually introduced as myth, a word that gently signals distance from fact. Myth implies metaphor, psychological truth rather than historical record, and yet, when examined closely, many of these accounts behave less like allegory and more like testimony. They contain sequences, causes and consequences, survivors and instructions. They do not describe abstract morality so much as lived experience remembered imperfectly. Flood narratives are the most familiar. They appear almost everywhere, often framed as divine judgment or natural imbalance. The details vary, but the structure remains stable. A prosperous world, a warning ignored or misunderstood, overwhelming water, near total destruction, and a small remnant that carries life forward. What is rarely addressed is how unnecessary such specificity would be if these stories were purely symbolic. Why water? Why not fire everywhere? Why preservation of seeds, animals, or knowledge? Why survival through elevation, vessels, or mountains? The repetition suggests not invention, but inheritance. Each culture seems to remember the same event differently, filtered through local geography and belief. Coastal societies emphasize rising seas. River civilizations speak of overflowing banks. Mountain cultures describe torrents and landslides. The core experience adapts, but the memory persists. Fire myths follow closely behind, stories of skies burning, of stars falling, of a sun that behaves strangely. Entire ages are said to end in heat and light, followed by darkness and cold. These are often dismissed as poetic exaggerations, yet they align uncomfortably well with known natural phenomena: volcanic winters, meteor impacts, solar instability. Once again, the problem is not that these events are known to science, but that their cultural memory appears far older and more widespread than official timelines allow. Darkness myths add another layer. Tales of long nights, years without summer, crops failing under dim skies. These are not dramatic flourishes. They describe specific conditions: prolonged cold, ash-filled air, disrupted seasons. When such stories appear independently across continents, they begin to resemble collective memory rather than coincidence. What makes these myths particularly compelling is what comes after the catastrophe. Survivors do not celebrate triumph. They rebuild cautiously. They establish rules, rituals, calendars. They mark time differently. They place enormous emphasis on remembrance and warning, encoding knowledge into story so it cannot be easily erased again. In many traditions, the survivors are instructed to rebuild civilization, not invent it. They are given laws, measurements, and moral frameworks that already exist, as if civilization itself is a recovered artifact. This detail is often overlooked, yet it undermines the idea of a first beginning. One does not rebuild what never existed. Over generations, these memories degrade. Precision gives way to symbolism. Practical instructions become moral lessons. The event itself recedes into the background, replaced by theology or folklore. But the emotional residue remains, a sense that the world is fragile, that endings have happened before, and that memory is the only defense against repetition. Modern interpretation often isolates these stories, treating each as a product of local imagination. But isolation dissolves pattern. When viewed together, the similarities become difficult to dismiss. They do not require a single global event to be meaningful. Multiple regional catastrophes, repeating across cycles, would produce exactly this kind of distributed memory. Each culture remembers its own ending, yet the endings rhyme. This perspective reframes myth not as fantasy, but as degraded history, not false, but incomplete. A record transmitted through generations that lacked stable archives, forced to compress experience into narrative that could survive collapse. In this sense, myth is what history becomes when writing fails. It is also worth noting what these stories rarely contain. They do not describe gradual decline. They do not describe slow progress. They describe interruption. Something happens, something ends, something restarts. This rhythm mirrors what we see in geology, in architecture, in chronology. Myth becomes another layer of evidence pointing towards cycles rather than continuity. There is a quiet tragedy embedded in these stories. Survivors often vow never to forget, yet forgetting is inevitable. Each retelling moves further from the source. Each generation understands less of what the warning truly meant. Eventually, the story becomes entertainment, ritual, or allegory. The original experience dissolves into abstraction. If previous civilizations encoded their endings into myth, it suggests an awareness we may lack. They understood that knowledge alone does not survive catastrophe. Only story does, and even story survives imperfectly. This raises an unsettling possibility. Perhaps myths are not exaggerations of small events, but minimizations of enormous ones. Perhaps what we call legend is what remains when the scale of loss exceeds the capacity of language. When entire worlds vanish, memory cannot preserve detail. It preserves only shape. As we listen to these ancient voices separated from us by time yet strangely familiar, a question lingers beneath the surface. Are these stories warning us about something that has already happened many times? Or are they simply reflections of our fear of impermanence? If civilization has ended before, then myth may be the only place those endings still exist. Not as proof, not as data, but as echo. And echoes, while faint, always come from something solid that once stood where silence now remains. What remains most difficult to confront is not the evidence we can see, but the silence where evidence should exist. Between civilizations, there are gaps that feel too clean, too absolute. Populations vanish from the record. Technologies stop evolving. Trade routes disappear. Writing systems collapse into nothing, only to reappear centuries later with no clear lineage connecting the two. These absences are often treated as mysteries of preservation, unfortunate accidents of time. But when the pattern repeats often enough, absence begins to feel intentional, or at least structural. History is typically narrated as a chain of inheritance. Knowledge passes from one culture to the next, modified but recognizable. Even collapses expected to leave debris, refugees carrying skills, neighboring societies absorbing fragments, continuity disguised as change. Yet there are moments where this chain appears severed entirely. Not weakened, not thinned, severed. In some regions, entire populations seem to decline sharply without clear cause. Archaeological layers show dense occupation, then almost nothing. Settlements empty. Fields return to wilderness. Tools cease to appear. And when people return generations later, they behave as if the land has no memory. They build anew, unaware of what lies beneath their feet. This is often explained as migration. People moved elsewhere, but migration leaves trails, camps, transitional technologies, blended cultures. In these cases, the trail fades too quickly. The disappearance is too complete. It is as if the survivors did not regroup, but scattered into conditions where preservation of knowledge was impossible. One explanation is collapse without recovery. Not every society rebounds. Some fall below a threshold from which complexity cannot be rebuilt easily. Literacy requires surplus. Specialized knowledge requires stability. When those conditions vanish, skills narrow rapidly. A population can survive biologically while losing the ability to transmit anything beyond immediate necessity. If such collapses happened repeatedly, the result would be exactly what we observe. Civilizations appearing isolated from one another, reinventing tools, rediscovering principles that were once known, unaware they are walking a path already traveled. Progress would look staggered, uneven, strangely redundant. The silence is also evident in technology. There are inventions that emerge, vanish, and re-emerge centuries later with no documented continuity. Techniques for working stone, managing water, navigating by the stars. Each time they appear, they are treated as breakthroughs. Each time they disappear, the loss is minimized. But loss on this scale suggests not regression, but rupture. Knowledge does not decay evenly. It collapses catastrophically when systems of transmission fail. Libraries burn, schools dissolve, specialists die without apprentices. What remains is practical know-how, the kind that can be taught through demonstration rather than theory. Over time, even that erodes. This would explain why some ancient cultures possess astonishing achievements alongside startling limitations. They remember fragments, not frameworks. They know how to build, but not why. They perform rituals whose origins they cannot explain. They preserve symbols long after their original meanings are lost. The gap, then, is not empty. It is filled with forgetting. Modern history struggles with forgetting because it is difficult to document. There are no artifacts labelled lost knowledge. There are only absences, inferred from what fails to connect. This makes it easy to dismiss silence as coincidence. But silence, when patterned, becomes data. Consider how quickly modern knowledge would fracture under prolonged disruption. Without electricity, digital records vanish. Without industry, complex manufacturing collapses. Without education systems, advanced mathematics and science retreat into obscurity within a few generations. What would survive would be stories, habits, and simplified tools. Future archaeologists might marvel at scattered remnants of our world, unable to reconstruct the systems that produced them. Now imagine this process occurring not once but many times. Each collapse would erase context more thoroughly than objects. Artifacts without explanation become curiosities. Structures without records become puzzles. Over time, the narrative of continuity gives way to a series of isolated peaks, each treated as a separate beginning. This perspective reframes the idea of progress. What we interpret as humanity slowly climbing may instead be humanity repeatedly recovering. Each ascent starts lower than the last left off, because so much has been forgotten. What feels like innovation may be rediscovery without memory. There is also a psychological dimension to this silence. Admitting large gaps challenges authority. Institutions of knowledge depend on continuity. A broken chain undermines confidence in the narrative itself. It is far easier to smooth over gaps than to confront the possibility that we do not know where we came from, and yet the gaps persist. They appear in the mismatch between genetic continuity and cultural discontinuity. Humans remain, but their worlds change abruptly. Languages reset. Belief systems restart. Symbols recur without explanation, as if remembered subconsciously rather than taught. These silences may also explain why ancient cultures place such emphasis on preservation through ritual and myth. When material continuity cannot be guaranteed, memory must become portable. Story becomes archive. Repetition becomes defense against erasure. Even so, much is lost. The unsettling thought is not that knowledge disappears, but that it disappears quietly. No final monument marks its passing, no record announces the end. One generation simply fails to pass something on, and the chain breaks. If we are living after multiple such breaks, then our history is not incomplete by accident. It is incomplete by design of circumstance. Each collapse selects what survives, not based on importance, but on resilience. What can endure chaos remains. What cannot is erased. The silence between civilizations, then, is not empty. It is crowded with forgotten attempts, abandoned solutions, and unasked questions. It is the space where entire worlds may have existed without leaving names behind. As we move forward, the question becomes less about what evidence we can uncover, and more about how much has been lost beyond recovery, and whether our own civilization, confident in its permanence, is already creating the next silence that future generations will struggle to explain. At a certain point, the question shifts. It is no longer only about what ended civilizations, but about how their endings were interpreted, managed, and remembered, if they were remembered at all. Natural catastrophe is an obvious suspect. The Earth provides no shortage of mechanisms capable of disruption, but there is another possibility, quieter and more unsettling, that collapse is not always accidental, and erasure is not always passive. This is where intention enters the conversation, not as a conspiracy, but as a human tendency. When societies fracture, power does not vanish evenly. It concentrates. Survivors reorganize. New authorities emerge, often in the aftermath of chaos, when fear and confusion create space for control. In these moments, memory becomes negotiable. History is not preserved by those who live through catastrophe. It is preserved by those who stabilize afterward, and stabilization often requires simplification. Narratives are narrowed. Causes are moralized. Timelines are reset. What no longer serves cohesion is quietly discarded. This does not require a global cabal or coordinated deception. It requires only survival pressure. A fragmented population cannot carry infinite memory. Choices must be made about what to keep. Over time, these choices harden into doctrine. What was once a pragmatic omission becomes sacred truth. Natural disasters may initiate collapse, but social systems decide what comes next. They determine which stories are told, which are tolerated, and which are forbidden. Knowledge that challenges the legitimacy of the new order is dangerous. It implies that the present is temporary, that authority is inherited rather than earned, that collapse is cyclical rather than exceptional. In this context, erasure becomes adaptive. Throughout recorded history, there are repeated instances of knowledge being restricted, standardized, or destroyed in the name of order. Libraries burn, texts are banned, alternative chronologies are labeled heretical. This is often framed as ideological conflict, but beneath it lies something more fundamental. Control over the past shapes control over the future. If previous civilizations ended abruptly, leaving behind fragments of advanced understanding, those fragments would be destabilizing. They would suggest that collapse is not divine punishment or moral failure, but structural vulnerability. They would imply that no system is permanent. For emerging powers, this is not a comforting message. So memory is curated. Dangerous knowledge is reframed as myth. Anomalous artifacts are attributed to gods or legends. Timelines are compressed until the past feels manageable, linear, and safe. What remains is a story that supports continuity rather than cycles. This does not mean that every institution consciously hides the truth. Over generations, curation becomes tradition. Assumptions fossilize. Questions stop being asked because the framework no longer allows them. By the time modern scholarship arrives, the erasure has already been normalized. Even science is not immune to this process. Paradigms define what questions are acceptable. Evidence that falls outside expectation is treated as error, contamination, or coincidence. Anomalies are tolerated only if they can be absorbed without disrupting the model. When they cannot, they are sidelined. This is not malice. It is inertia. The idea that civilization resets challenges the core narrative of progress. It suggests that intelligence does not guarantee survival, that complexity increases vulnerability, and that collapse is not a failure to be avoided but a phase to be understood. These are not easy ideas to integrate into systems built on confidence and growth. So the question becomes, how much of what we call erasure is simply the result of forgetting, and how much is the result of selective remembering? In many cultures, the transition from one era to another is marked by the establishment of a new calendar. Time begins again. The previous world is described as corrupt, chaotic, or incomplete. This framing legitimizes the present by delegitimizing the past. It also severs continuity, making it harder for future generations to trace what truly happened. If such resets occurred repeatedly, each one would strip away more context. The deeper past would recede not because it never existed, but because it was overwritten again and again. What survives would be what aligned with power, belief, and necessity. There is also the role of fear. Knowledge of previous collapses carries an implicit warning. It suggests that systems can fail suddenly, that preparation may be futile, that control is an illusion. Societies often respond to such fear not by confronting it, but by suppressing it. Forgetting becomes a form of psychological protection. Over time, this creates a strange inversion. The more fragile a civilization is, the more it insists on its permanence. The more uncertain its future, the more rigid its history becomes. Flexibility is sacrificed for stability, even if that stability is built on omission. This lens does not require imagining a single force controlling history. It only requires acknowledging that humans shape narratives under pressure, that survival favors coherence over completeness, that memory is filtered through the needs of the present. If we are indeed living in the aftermath of multiple resets, then the question of erasure is not binary, it is layered. Natural forces destroy, social forces simplify, institutions stabilize, and over time the past becomes unrecognizable. What remains are fragments that feel out of place. Advanced structures in primitive contexts, myths that remember too much, timelines that strain under compression. These are not mistakes. They are seams where erasure was incomplete. The unsettling possibility is that we are not exceptional in this process, that our own civilization is already selecting what will be remembered and what will be lost, that future survivors may inherit a version of us that is tidy, moralized, and incomplete. If collapse comes again, the Earth will do what it always has, and we will do what we always have: rebuild, simplify, and forget. The question is not whether erasure happens, but whether we can recognize it while it is still in progress. Because once forgetting becomes tradition, it no longer feels like loss. It feels like truth. Memory does not survive on its own. It requires shelter. It requires guardians. And throughout history, those guardians have taken the form of institutions: libraries, temples, schools, archives, structures built not only of stone, but of authority. These institutions decide what is worth preserving and what is safe to forget. They do not merely store knowledge, they filter it. When we imagine the loss of ancient knowledge, we often picture flames, a library burning, texts turning to ash, a single dramatic moment of destruction. But this image is misleading. Most knowledge is not lost in fire, it is lost through selection, through copying one text instead of another, through teaching one version of history while allowing others to fade quietly into obscurity. Every archive is a choice. In periods of stability, these choices feel benign. There is time to preserve nuance, to tolerate contradiction. But after collapse, after war, famine, or environmental upheaval, memory becomes dangerous. Too much uncertainty threatens cohesion. Too many competing narratives fracture identity. In these moments, institutions narrow their focus. They simplify. They standardize. This is how history becomes official. When centralized powers emerge from chaos, they inherit fragments of the past. These fragments are rarely complete. They must be assembled into something usable. In doing so, contradictions are resolved not by investigation, but by elimination. A clean timeline is easier to teach than a fractured one. A single origin story is easier to defend than a cyclical past. Knowledge that implies repetition, especially repetition of collapse, is destabilizing. It suggests that no system is permanent, that authority is provisional, that survival is not guaranteed by belief or structure. For institutions tasked with maintaining order, this is an uncomfortable foundation. So the past is edited. This process is rarely malicious. It is practical. Scribes copy what they understand. Teachers teach what aligns with accepted frameworks. Scholars pursue questions that can be answered without undermining the model they depend on. Over time, the boundaries of inquiry shrink. What lies outside them becomes invisible. Consider how easily certain texts are labelled apocryphal, marginal, or symbolic. These labels do not deny existence. They deny relevance. A text may be acknowledged but stripped of authority. Its claims are reframed as metaphor. Its timelines dismissed as allegory. In this way, disruptive ideas are neutralized without confrontation. This is especially true of knowledge that challenges linear history. Deep time is uncomfortable. Cycles blur beginnings and endings. They make it difficult to assign credit, to trace progress, to locate a singular moment of creation. Institutions prefer clarity, even when clarity requires reduction. Libraries, for all their power, are fragile ecosystems. They depend on continuity, of language, of classification, of cultural value. When that continuity breaks, entire categories of knowledge vanish. Not because they were destroyed, but because no one knew how to read them anymore. A script becomes undecipherable. A context is lost. A symbol survives without meaning. This is another form of erasure. Over centuries, what remains is not the full spectrum of past knowledge, but what was repeatedly chosen for preservation. The rest dissolves into silence. And silence, once normalized, is mistaken for absence. Modern systems of knowledge inherit these silences. They are built atop already curated foundations. Scholars work within frameworks shaped by decisions made long before them. Challenging those frameworks is difficult, not because evidence is lacking, but because the tools to interpret that evidence have been shaped to exclude certain possibilities. This is why anomalies persist without resolution. An artifact that does not fit the timeline is debated endlessly, never integrated. A structure that appears too advanced is reclassified as ceremonial. A text that suggests deeper antiquity is translated cautiously, its implications softened. The institution remains intact. The anomaly remains isolated. Over time, this isolation creates an illusion of coherence. The past appears orderly because disorder has been filtered out. What we call consensus is often the residue of centuries of selection, not a neutral reflection of evidence. Yet the cracks show. They appear when different disciplines overlap and disagree, when geology suggests timelines that archaeology resists, when mythology preserves memories that history cannot place, when architecture contradicts the developmental stages assigned to its builders. Each crack reveals a pressure point where preservation failed to erase everything. There is also a human cost to this filtering. When knowledge of previous collapses is lost, each generation believes itself to be unique. Mistakes are repeated. Warnings encoded in story are dismissed as fantasy. The cycle continues, not because it must, but because it is not recognized. Institutions are not villains in this process. They are products of it. They exist to stabilize meaning in an unstable world. But stability has a price. It trades depth for clarity, complexity for coherence. If civilization has risen and fallen multiple times, then our institutions are not the first to curate memory. They are simply the latest, and like their predecessors, they are shaped by the conditions of their survival. What they preserve will define what future civilizations believe about us. This raises a quiet, unsettling thought. Perhaps the greatest loss is not specific knowledge, but the awareness that loss itself is recurring. If we do not remember that civilizations end, we are less prepared when they do. The evidence of erasure, then, is not hidden in secret vaults or forbidden rooms. It is hidden in plain sight, in what feels settled, in what feels unquestionable. It is embedded in curricula, classifications, and categories that shape understanding before inquiry begins. As we move deeper into this journey, the question is no longer whether knowledge has been lost. That is certain. The question is whether what remains is enough to recognize the pattern before it repeats again. Because once institutions decide what history is allowed to be, forgetting no longer feels like loss. It feels like order. There is a category of knowledge that rarely announces itself as forbidden. It does not always arrive wrapped in prohibition or guarded by threats. More often, it is quietly sidelined, labelled impractical, speculative, or dangerous to social coherence. This kind of knowledge does not vanish through force alone. It fades through discomfort. Every civilization develops ideas it cannot comfortably integrate. Concepts that challenge identity, authority, or destiny are treated with caution. They may be studied briefly, then set aside. They may be preserved in fragments stripped of context, or reinterpreted until they no longer threaten the prevailing order. Over time, what was once unsettling becomes unintelligible. In the context of repeated civilizational collapse, certain forms of knowledge would be especially destabilizing. Any idea suggesting that advanced societies existed before and failed undermines the myth of inevitable progress. It suggests that intelligence does not guarantee permanence, that mastery of nature does not prevent collapse, and that history does not move toward resolution. These ideas do not inspire confidence. They inspire humility, and humility is rarely useful to power. This may explain why some ancient insights survive only as shadows, mathematical relationships embedded in sacred architecture, but not explained, astronomical cycles encoded in myth, but detached from observation, philosophical ideas preserved as allegory rather than argument. The knowledge remains, but its edge is dulled. Forbidden knowledge in this sense is not always banned, it is neutralized. Across history, there are recurring tensions between open inquiry and controlled doctrine. Periods of exploration are followed by periods of consolidation. Questions multiply, then narrow. What cannot be reconciled with the dominant worldview is reframed as symbolic, mystical, or irrelevant. The idea is not to erase it completely, but to render it harmless. This is particularly true of knowledge that crosses boundaries. Ideas that link earth and sky, matter and consciousness, time and recurrence. Such concepts resist compartmentalization. They blur distinctions between science, philosophy, and spirituality. Institutions built on clear divisions struggle to accommodate them. When these ideas persist, they often do so in encoded form. Numbers become sacred. Stories carry technical memory disguised as morality. Rituals preserve sequences long after their original purpose is forgotten. To later observers, These elements appear irrational or ceremonial. Their original function remains hidden not because it was destroyed, but because it no longer fits the language of the present. The danger of this kind of knowledge is not that it empowers rebellion, but that it reframes meaning. If previous civilizations rose and fell, then history is not a ladder but a loop. If advanced understanding once existed and was lost, then ignorance is not a starting point, but a consequence. These ideas shift responsibility. They suggest that collapse is not a failure of others, but a recurring human condition. Such implications are difficult to carry. They challenge narratives of chosenness, destiny, and exceptionalism. They complicate moral frameworks built on linear improvement. And so, they are often softened, abstracted, or removed from practical consideration. Over time, the line between forbidden and forgotten blurs. What was once controversial becomes obscure. What was once debated becomes misunderstood. Eventually it disappears from discourse altogether, surviving only as anomaly or curiosity. This process is visible in how certain ancient sciences are treated, not dismissed outright, but relegated to the margins. Their achievements are acknowledged, but their implications are not pursued. Precision is admired, but origins are not questioned. The result is admiration without inquiry. There is also a psychological comfort in believing that lost knowledge was primitive or symbolic. It reassures us that we stand at the pinnacle of understanding. It protects us from the unsettling idea that others may have known things we have forgotten. But forgetting is not neutral. It shapes behavior. Without memory of past collapses, societies repeat patterns blindly. Resource exploitation accelerates. Systems grow brittle. Warnings encoded in myth are dismissed as superstition. Each generation believes its challenges are unprecedented. Forbidden knowledge, then, is often knowledge of limits, limits to growth, limits to control, limits to prediction. It reminds us that complexity increases fragility, that specialization creates dependency, that resilience lies not in advancement alone, but in adaptability. These are not comfortable lessons. They do not sell optimism. They do not align with narratives of endless ascent, and so they remain underexplored, tucked away in interdisciplinary blind spots where no single field claims responsibility. Yet traces remain. They surface in recurring symbols, in stories that refuse to die, in architectural alignments whose purpose is no longer taught, in mathematical patterns preserved without explanation. Each trace suggests that something was once understood more fully than we are willing to admit. The question is not whether such knowledge was suppressed deliberately. In many cases, no suppression was needed. Time, catastrophe, and institutional preference did the work. What survived was what could be integrated into the new order. What could not was left behind. If we are indeed the inheritors of multiple forgotten worlds, then forbidden knowledge may not be hidden in secret archives. It may be embedded in the contradictions we overlook, the anomalies we accept without curiosity, the stories we dismiss too quickly. The deeper danger is not that such knowledge exists, but that it is ignored. Because knowledge of cycles carries a responsibility to prepare, to remember, to design systems that acknowledge impermanence rather than deny it. As long as civilization defines success as uninterrupted growth, any reminder of past endings will feel threatening, and so the reminders are softened, obscured, or forgotten. Not because they are false, but because they are inconvenient. In this light, forbidden knowledge is not about secrecy. It is about readiness, about whether a society is mature enough to face the possibility that it is not the first and will not be the last. And if that maturity has been lacking before, it may explain why such knowledge keeps slipping through our hands cycle after cycle, leaving us once again to rediscover it only after it is too late. There are moments when science, rather than closing questions, quietly opens them wider. These moments do not arrive as revolutions. They surface as footnotes, outliers, statistical noise, details that refuse to settle neatly into established models. They are not dramatic enough to overturn consensus, yet persistent enough to resist dismissal. Over time, they accumulate, forming a constellation of anomalies that suggest the story may be incomplete. One such anomaly is timing. According to conventional models, complex human behavior emerges slowly, hesitantly, through long periods of trial and error. And yet, the archaeological record often shows abrupt transitions. Periods of apparent simplicity are followed suddenly by bursts of sophistication. Symbolic art, advanced tool-making, long-distance trade, astronomical awareness. These leaps are frequently described as cognitive revolutions, but the mechanism remains unclear. Intelligence does not usually accelerate without cause. Another anomaly lies in distribution. Advanced ideas appear in places where conditions seem least favourable, while other regions with apparent advantages remain comparatively undeveloped. Technologies arise independently in distant locations with striking similarity, as if rediscovered rather than invented. Convergence can explain some of this, but not all. The recurrence feels less like coincidence and more like recollection. In geology, similar discomfort appears. There are events in Earth's recent past that occur too rapidly, too violently, to fit comfortably within gradualist expectations. Sudden temperature shifts, rapid sea level rise, massive sediment displacement. These events are acknowledged, but their cultural implications are often left unexplored. The planet's instability is treated as background noise rather than a central force shaping human continuity. Biology adds another layer. Genetic evidence suggests bottlenecks, moments when human populations shrink dramatically, then recover. These are often framed as near extinctions followed by resilience. But resilience does not imply preservation of culture. A species can survive biologically, while its accumulated knowledge collapses entirely. In such cases, continuity of genes masks discontinuity of civilization. There are also anomalies in material science. Certain ancient objects display properties that challenge assumptions about technological capability. Precision machining without clear tools, materials processed in ways that imply controlled environments. These are often explained individually, attributed to lost techniques or exceptional skill. Rarely are they considered collectively as part of a broader pattern. Science, by design, prefers reproducibility. An anomaly that cannot be replicated is treated with caution. But history is not a laboratory. Past conditions cannot be reproduced on demand. This creates a bias toward explanations that fit present understanding, even when those explanations feel strained. Another subtle anomaly appears in measurement itself. The units used by ancient cultures often encode relationships that reflect sophisticated mathematical understanding. Ratios repeat across structures separated by geography and time. These patterns are frequently dismissed as coincidence or aesthetic preference, yet repetition across independent contexts suggests intention, and intention suggests knowledge. When these anomalies are raised, the response is often compartmentalization. Each is assigned to a different field, a different specialist, a different explanation. Archaeology addresses one, geology another, astronomy another. But the anomalies do not exist in isolation. They intersect, and it is at their intersections that the discomfort grows. The reluctance to connect these dots is understandable. Connecting them leads toward conclusions that challenge the foundation of linear history. It implies that advanced knowledge may have existed earlier than accepted, that it may have been lost, that we are not observing the birth of complexity, but its repeated re-emergence. Science does not reject this possibility outright. It simply lacks a framework to integrate it. Current models are optimized for continuity. They excel at explaining gradual development, adaptation, and accumulation. They struggle with reset. Reset introduces variables that resist prediction. It implies that systems can collapse faster than they evolve, that complexity can vanish more quickly than it forms. That knowledge is not a one-way inheritance, but a fragile arrangement dependent on stability. In this light, anomalies become signals rather than errors. They suggest moments where the system we use to interpret the past is misaligned with the past itself. The evidence does not change, the lens does. This does not mean science is wrong. It means science is incomplete, as it always has been. Its strength lies in revision, not certainty. But revision requires questions that feel safe to ask. And questions about forgotten civilizations, deep resets, and lost knowledge still sit uncomfortably close to speculation. Yet speculation is not fantasy when it is grounded in evidence. It is hypothesis. And hypothesis is the engine of understanding. The real tension, then, is not between science and alternative ideas, but between explanation an implication. To accept that anomalies point toward repeated civilizational collapse is to accept vulnerability. It means acknowledging that intelligence alone does not save us, that progress does not immunize against loss, that the future is not guaranteed by the past. These are heavy conclusions. They resist optimism. They demand humility. Perhaps this is why anomalies are allowed to exist, but not to speak to one another. Each remains manageable on its own. Together they form a narrative that is difficult to contain. If we are indeed living after several forgotten peaks of human achievement, then science is not failing by uncovering anomalies. It is succeeding. It is doing exactly what it is meant to do, reveal where understanding ends and mystery begins. The question is whether we will treat these anomalies as noise to be filtered out, or as signals pointing toward a larger pattern. A pattern that suggests civilization is not a singular ascent, but a series of fragile equilibria, repeatedly formed and repeatedly broken. And if that pattern is real, then the anomalies are not curiosities of the past. They are warnings. Quiet, technical, easily overlooked warnings, whispering that what happened before could happen again, not because we are ignorant, but because forgetting is built into the cycle itself. Once the idea of forgetting is accepted, another possibility quietly emerges, one that feels heavier than all the others combined. What if advanced civilizations did not simply exist before us, but existed many times? Not as a single lost golden age, but as multiple peaks scattered across deep time, each one reaching sophistication, each one collapsing, each one leaving behind only partial traces. This idea does not require imagining identical worlds repeating themselves. Each civilization would have been shaped by different climates, different geographies, different pressures. Their technologies may not resemble ours. Their sciences may not have taken mechanical or digital form. Advancement does not follow a single path. It adapts to context, but complexity in any form leaves signatures. If several advanced societies preceded us, their remains would not appear evenly distributed. They would surface as anomalies, out-of-place precision, unexplained alignments, sudden bursts of capability that appear without developmental build-up. Exactly the kinds of things that already trouble the historical record. The difficulty lies in recognition. We tend to search for reflections of ourselves, metal, machines, writing systems similar to our own. When we do not find them, we assume absence. But intelligence can manifest through stone, sound, geometry, astronomy, and environmental engineering. Knowledge can be embedded in landscapes rather than objects. When such systems collapse, their traces are harder to identify. An advanced civilization that relied on organic materials, acoustic principles, or symbolic encoding would leave little behind after catastrophe. What survived would be indirect. Structures too durable to erase completely, patterns too intentional to be random. Later societies would inherit these remnants without understanding their original context. This inheritance creates confusion. Builders copy forms without grasping function. Rituals preserve actions without meaning. Symbols repeat because they feel important, not because they are understood. Over time, what was once practical becomes sacred. What was once science becomes myth. If this process occurred repeatedly, the archaeological record would not show a neat ladder of progress. It would show scattered plateaus, moments of sudden sophistication followed by regression. Regions that appear ahead of their time then vanish from influence. Civilizations that seem to start at an improbably high level then forget what they knew. From this perspective, humanity's story is not one of slow awakening but of repeated amnesia. Each cycle inherits fragments from the last, enough to accelerate development, not enough to preserve continuity. Progress resumes, but from an incomplete foundation. This reframes the question of origins entirely. Instead of asking when civilization began, we must ask how many times it has restarted. The answer may not be recoverable. Deep time erases context too efficiently. But the pattern may still be visible in repetition itself. It also reframes our sense of uniqueness. We often define ourselves as exceptional, technologically, intellectually, morally. But if others reached similar heights and still fell, then exceptionality offers no immunity. It only increases the scale of potential loss. There is a subtle arrogance embedded in the belief that we are the first to understand the universe deeply, that we are the first to map the skies, measure time, manipulate matter. It comforts us to believe that complexity accumulates naturally, that once discovered, knowledge is permanent. History suggests otherwise. Knowledge survives only under specific conditions: stability, redundancy, transmission. Remove any one of these, and even the most sophisticated understanding can disappear within a few generations. A civilization does not need to be primitive to forget. It only needs to be interrupted. If earlier advanced societies existed, their downfall would not necessarily be dramatic. It could be incremental. A climate shift that undermines agriculture, a geological event that destabilizes regions, a loss of trade networks that fragment specialization. Over time, complexity collapses inward, until only the most basic practices remain. Survivors would not call themselves advanced, they would call themselves alive. This is perhaps why ancient traditions often speak of ancestors who were greater, wiser, closer to the gods, not because they were divine, but because they remembered more. Each generation senses loss without being able to name it. Reverence replaces understanding. Modern discomfort with this idea is understandable. Multiple lost civilizations imply that collapse is not an aberration, but a recurring outcome. It implies that our systems, however impressive, are temporary arrangements rather than final solutions. It implies that history does not move towards safety. And yet, this discomfort may be precisely why the idea deserves attention. If we are the 7th civilization, or the 8th, or the 12th, the number itself matters less than the implication. That intelligence does not break the cycle. Awareness might. Recognition changes behavior. A society that understands collapse as a historical constant may prioritize resilience over expansion, memory over novelty, continuity over acceleration. It may design systems that expect disruption rather than deny it. But such a shift requires humility. It requires accepting that others may have stood where we stand now, equally confident, equally unaware of what was coming next. It requires accepting that progress is not destiny. The traces left behind by previous civilizations, if they exist, are not messages of triumph. They are warnings written in stone, alignment, and myth. They do not say, "Look how great we were." They say, "We were here, and now we are not." If those messages have reached us at all, it is only because erasure was incomplete. Because some things are harder to destroy than memory expects. Because patterns endure even when names vanish. The unsettling thought is not that we might be living after many forgotten worlds. It is that those worlds may have believed just as we do, that they had finally escaped the cycle. And if that belief was part of what doomed them, then the most dangerous illusion we carry may be the idea that collapse belongs only to the past. Because cycles do not announce themselves when they begin again. They feel like continuity. They feel like progress. They feel like permanence, until they don't. At some point, the question stops being historical and becomes existential. If civilizations have risen and fallen repeatedly, then the pattern is no longer about the past alone. It reaches forward. It reaches toward us. And in that reach, a different kind of unease begins to form, not about what was lost, but about what is returning. Across disciplines, there is a growing sense that something long forgotten is resurfacing, not as memory, but as intuition. Ancient symbols reappear in modern research. Old questions resurface under new names. Patterns once dismissed as superstition are quietly re-examined through data, mathematics, and systems theory. This is not nostalgia. It is convergence. Civilizations that forget their predecessors tend to rediscover similar ideas when they reach comparable levels of complexity. Not because history repeats perfectly, but because constraints repeat. Energy limits, environmental thresholds, social fragility. Each time a society expands, it encounters the same boundaries and begins asking the same questions about time, cycles, stability, and meaning. This may be why certain ancient concepts feel unexpectedly modern. The idea that systems oscillate rather than progress endlessly. That equilibrium is temporary. That collapse is not failure, but transition. These ideas now appear in ecology, climate science, economics, and even physics. They emerge independently, yet point in the same direction. What is different now is scale. Previous civilizations, if they existed, were likely regional. Their collapses, while devastating, were localized. Memory could restart elsewhere. Today, civilization is global. Knowledge networks are intertwined. Supply systems are tightly coupled. A disruption in one domain propagates instantly across others. The margin for isolated recovery has narrowed. This changes the stakes of forgetting. Modern society prides itself on redundancy, backups, archives, distributed systems, and yet much of our knowledge exists in fragile forms, dependent on continuous energy and maintenance. Remove that continuity, and the illusion of permanence collapses quickly. The sophistication that defines us becomes our vulnerability. This realization has begun to surface in unexpected places, in discussions about resilience rather than efficiency, in renewed interest in oral tradition, decentralized knowledge, and low-tech sustainability. In the quiet acknowledgement that not all progress is adaptive, it is as if civilization is beginning to sense the edge of a familiar pattern without consciously recognizing it. Ancient cultures often spoke of ages turning, not ending, a wheel rather than a line. These metaphors were long dismissed as poetic or religious, but wheels appear everywhere in complex systems: feedback loops, oscillations, phase shifts, collapse followed by reorganization. Modern science now uses different language, but the structure is the same. What may be returning then is not lost technology, but lost perspective, an understanding that permanence is illusion, that memory must be actively protected, that growth without restraint accelerates fragility. These ideas do not guarantee survival, but ignoring them has proven costly before. There is also a subtle psychological shift underway. The certainty that defined previous centuries is eroding. Confidence in mastery gives way to awareness of limits. Climate instability, ecological stress, systemic risk. These are not fringe concerns. They are signals that the environment humanity depends on is not static. In earlier cycles, such signals may have gone unrecognized or been mythologized after the fact. This time they are measurable, modeled, tracked in real time. And yet recognition alone does not ensure response. Awareness does not automatically translate into change. This is where the echo of previous civilizations feels closest. Not in their achievements, but in their hesitation. The moment when warning signs are visible, but action feels disruptive. When adaptation is possible, but inconvenient. When continuity is assumed because collapse has not yet arrived. If earlier worlds existed, they likely faced similar moments. Thresholds where systems could be restructured, but were not. Where memory warned, but was not fully understood. Where confidence outweighed caution. The difference now is memory itself. For the first time, humanity has the tools to recognize patterns across deep time, to compare myths with geology, architecture with astronomy, collapsed narratives with climate data. The fragments are closer to alignment than ever before, but alignment does not guarantee acceptance. To acknowledge that we may be repeating a cycle is to accept responsibility for breaking it. That responsibility is uncomfortable. It demands humility, restraint, and long-term thinking in systems that reward speed and expansion. It demands remembering what instinct encourages us to forget. If this is the seventh civilization, then it is not defined by how many came before, but by whether it recognizes the pattern at all. Awareness may not prevent collapse, but ignorance ensures repetition. Perhaps this is why echoes feel louder now, why old questions return with urgency, why ancient warnings resonate in modern language, not because the past is calling to us, but because the conditions that produced it are assembling again. The unsettling possibility is that every civilization reaches this point, a moment of partial recognition, a narrowing window where memory could alter trajectory. Most pass through it without noticing, convinced that their circumstances are unprecedented. If we are standing in such a moment now, then the evidence of forgotten worlds is not merely historical curiosity, it is context, it is orientation, it is the difference between believing collapse is impossible and understanding that it is optional, but only briefly. What comes next is not predetermined. Cycles describe tendencies, not destinies. But breaking a cycle requires seeing it clearly, without comfort, without denial. And if earlier civilizations failed to do so, their silence may not be accusation. It may be invitation. An invitation to remember, not who they were, but what they learned too late. If fragments of lost civilization still speak to us, they do so in subtle ways, never as instructions, never as complete explanations, but as echoes embedded in form rather than language. These echoes often survive not in texts, but in symbols, rituals, proportions, and patterns that persist long after their original context has vanished. They are the residue of knowledge that adapted itself to forgetting. Symbols endure because they can travel without explanation. A geometric form can survive translation. A repeated ratio can be preserved without being understood. A ritual can be performed without remembering why it began. In this way, information becomes resilient by becoming opaque. Meaning is sacrificed so that structure can remain. Across cultures, certain symbols appear again and again: spirals, circles, intersecting lines, stepped forms, mirrored figures. They are often treated as decorative or spiritual motifs, yet many of them encode relationships between cycles and time, between earth and sky, between human scale and planetary scale. These are not random designs, they are compressions of observation. Consider how ancient societies represented time, rarely as a straight line, more often as a circle, a wheel, a returning path. This choice is revealing. A linear model emphasizes progress and destination. A cyclical model emphasizes recurrence and return. One assumes novelty, the other assumes memory. If earlier civilizations understood collapse as inevitable, or at least recurring, then encoding knowledge into cyclical symbols would make sense. Symbols survive when explanations do not. They can be reinterpreted endlessly, carrying structure forward even as meaning shifts. Ritual functions similarly. Many ancient practices appear irrational when judged by modern standards. Repetitive movements, chants, alignments performed on specific dates. But rituals are not designed for efficiency. They are designed for continuity. They preserve sequence, they ensure repetition. They transmit timing and coordination across generations. When technical understanding is lost, ritual remains. What was once calibration becomes ceremony. What was once instruction becomes tradition. The action persists even when the reason fades. This is not failure. It is adaptation. There is also sound. Acoustics embedded in ancient spaces hint at knowledge that does not require writing. Certain structures amplify, resonate, or dampen sound in precise ways. These effects are often dismissed as incidental or symbolic, but sound-based knowledge is inherently transient. It leaves no artifact beyond the space itself. If such knowledge was once central, its disappearance would leave behind architecture that feels purposeful but inexplicable. Symbolic knowledge is difficult to categorize because it does not behave like modern science. It does not separate observation from meaning. It does not distinguish between practical and spiritual. This makes it easy to dismiss. But dismissal may be a mistake. When knowledge must survive instability, it embeds itself where it is least likely to be erased. Myth operates on the same principle. Stories compress experience into narrative that can survive oral transmission. Technical detail is lost, but structure remains. Flood myths preserve the sequence of disaster. Creation myths preserve the order of emergence. Apocalypse myths preserve the inevitability of endings. These are not predictions. They are memories adapted for survival. If earlier civilizations encoded their understanding this way, then what survives to us is not a manual, but a map without a legend. We see the shapes, but not the scale. We sense importance, but not application. Meaning flickers at the edge of comprehension. Modern thought often separates symbolic knowledge from empirical knowledge, ranking one as subjective and the other as real. But this distinction may be a luxury of stability. In unstable conditions, the priority shifts from precision to persistence. Symbolic systems trade clarity for endurance. This reframes the idea of lost science. Perhaps it was not lost because it was inferior, but because it was too context-dependent, too reliant on conditions that did not survive collapse. What endured was what could travel light. There is also an emotional dimension to this transmission. Awe, fear, reverence. These emotions bind memory more effectively than data. A civilization that experienced collapse would likely encode its warnings emotionally rather than analytically. The goal would not be explanation, but remembrance. This may explain why so many ancient symbols feel charged rather than informative. They are not meant to be solved, they are meant to be felt. Their purpose is to provoke recognition, not understanding, to trigger intuition rather than logic. When modern researchers encounter these symbols, the response is often confusion. They do not fit into neat categories. They seem meaningful without being explicit. This ambiguity frustrates analysis, leading many to dismiss them as purely spiritual or decorative. But ambiguity may be the point. A symbol that survives collapse must be flexible. It must allow reinterpretation. It must adapt to new languages, new beliefs, new contexts. A rigid message would shatter. A fluid one endures. If this is true, then the echoes of lost civilizations are not hidden because they are secret. They are hidden because they are incomplete. They require reconstruction across disciplines: architecture, astronomy, anthropology, psychology. No single field holds the key. This also means that rediscovery is gradual. Pieces align slowly. Patterns emerge reluctantly. Recognition comes as unease rather than certainty, a sense that something familiar is being remembered without being recalled. Perhaps this is what we are experiencing now, a moment when symbolic fragments begin to resonate with modern understanding, when cycles described in myth align with models in science, when ancient warnings mirror contemporary concerns. If earlier civilizations reached similar moments, they may have felt the same tension, the pull between remembering and moving forward, between acknowledging fragility and asserting control. Symbols may have been their compromise, a way to carry awareness without being paralyzed by it. The unsettling thought is that symbols alone were not enough, that despite encoding memory into every resilient form available, collapse still came. Not because knowledge was absent, but because recognition did not translate into action. If we are inheriting these symbols now, the question is not whether we can decode them perfectly. The question is whether we can hear what they are trying to preserve. Not technical instruction, but perspective. They remind us that worlds have ended before, that knowledge can be lost even when it is embedded everywhere, that memory, however cleverly encoded, does not save a civilization unless it is acted upon. Symbols are not solutions, they are reminders. And if the echoes of a lost civilization still reach us, faint but persistent, it may be because forgetting was never total, because some part of humanity always tries to leave a mark that says, "Pay attention." This has happened before. Whether we understand that message in time remains an open question, one that no symbol can answer for us. Only choice can. There is a comfort in believing that we are the first to stand where we stand now. It grants meaning to effort. It frames struggle as progress. It turns uncertainty into destiny. This comfort is not accidental. It is psychological, deeply rooted, and quietly reinforced by the stories we tell about ourselves. To imagine that others reached similar heights and still fell is unsettling in a way that statistics or data rarely are. It challenges not only history but identity. Exceptionalism is not arrogance in the simple sense. It is a coping mechanism. It allows a civilization to justify risk, expansion, and sacrifice by anchoring them to a future imagined as permanent. If we are the first, then mistakes are understandable. If we are the last, then everything becomes urgent. But if we are one among many, then neither justification holds easily. This may explain why narratives of origin are so carefully protected. A single beginning implies a single direction. It transforms complexity into a ladder rather than a maze. From that ladder, every step upward feels earned, every challenge temporary. Collapse becomes an external threat rather than an internal possibility. Yet the evidence explored so far presses against this comfort. Geological resets, broken chronologies, inherited architecture, fragmented myths, institutional filtering, human amnesia. Each points toward repetition rather than novelty, and repetition undermines the emotional safety of exceptionalism. There is also a moral dimension. If previous civilizations failed, then intelligence alone does not confer virtue. Advancement does not imply wisdom. Technology does not guarantee restraint. These realizations complicate the moral narrative of progress, which often equates new capability with improvement. Modern societies, particularly those built on rapid innovation, depend heavily on this moral narrative. It allows disruption to be framed as growth. It allows exploitation to be framed as development. It allows risk to be framed as necessity. Questioning the uniqueness of our moment destabilizes these frames. This is not merely academic discomfort. It touches governance, economics, belief systems. If collapse is cyclical, then planning for permanence becomes questionable. If knowledge has been lost before, then preservation becomes more important than expansion. These shifts challenge deeply embedded priorities. There is also fear beneath the comfort. To accept that others stood where we stand is to accept that we may not see what is coming, that confidence does not equal foresight, that blind spots may be structural rather than accidental. This fear does not lend itself easily to optimism, so the mind resists. It prefers linear timelines because they imply control. It prefers first beginnings because they imply purpose. It prefers uniqueness because it implies exemption. These preferences shape not only popular belief, but scholarly emphasis. Questions that threaten them are often reframed, deferred, or quietly set aside. This resistance does not require denial. It operates through emphasis, through what is studied intensely and what is treated as peripheral, through which anomalies are pursued and which are labelled curiosities, through which stories are repeated and which are footnoted. Even language reflects this bias. We speak of primitive beginnings and advanced modernity as if complexity naturally increases over time. We rarely speak of fragility increasing alongside it. We rarely ask whether sophistication carries hidden costs. Yet when viewed without the lens of exceptionalism, history looks different. Progress appears uneven. Gains coexist with vulnerability. Peaks are followed by sudden drops. Continuity depends less on brilliance than on stability. In this light, earlier civilizations do not appear foolish or inferior. They appear human, subject to the same pressures, the same incentives, the same blind spots. Their collapse does not diminish their achievements. It contextualizes them. This reframing is uncomfortable because it removes the distance we place between ourselves and the past. It collapses then and now into a shared condition. It suggests that what we face is not unprecedented but recurring. The danger of exceptionalism is not that it inflates ego. It is that it narrows imagination. It limits the range of futures we consider possible. If collapse belongs only to the past, then preparation feels unnecessary. If loss happened only to others, then warning signs feel abstract. Ancient cultures often framed their stories differently. They did not assume exemption. They assumed return. Cycles were expected. Decline was anticipated. Rituals existed not to celebrate dominance, but to maintain balance. This worldview did not prevent collapse, but it shaped how collapse was understood. Modern culture, by contrast, often treats collapse as failure rather than phase, as error rather than outcome. This framing discourages honest engagement with vulnerability. It encourages delay, denial, and deflection. If we are truly unique, then none of this matters. The past is irrelevant. The cycle is broken. But if we are not, if we are one iteration among many, then exceptionalism becomes a liability, because it blinds us to precedent. The unsettling possibility is that every civilization believes itself exceptional, right up until it can no longer sustain that belief. That confidence peaks just before fragility becomes visible. That certainty precedes surprise. This does not mean collapse is inevitable. Cycles describe tendencies, not fates. But breaking a tendency requires recognizing it, and recognition requires letting go of comforting illusions. To question exceptionalism is not to abandon hope. It is to ground hope in realism rather than assumption. It is to accept that survival may depend less on advancement than on restraint, less on speed than on memory. If earlier civilizations failed in part because they believed they had transcended the conditions that shaped those before them, then remembering their humility may be more valuable than remembering their technologies. Perhaps the greatest legacy they could leave us is not proof of their existence, but a warning embedded in absence, a reminder that confidence feels strongest just before it is tested. If we are the seventh civilization, then the most important question is not how many came before us, but whether we are willing to see ourselves as one among them. Because the belief that "This time is different" has been uttered many times before, and history suggests it has never protected anyone for very long. As the illusion of exceptionalism weakens, something else begins to take its place. Not certainty, but awareness. A quieter, more fragile state of mind. It does not promise salvation or predict collapse. It simply acknowledges pattern. And in that acknowledgement, a narrow space opens where choice becomes possible. Across modern discourse, there is an increasing sense that the future is not guaranteed by the past. Systems once assumed stable now feel precarious. Climate behaves unpredictably. Economic structures oscillate between growth and shock. Technologies accelerate faster than social adaptation can follow. These are not isolated concerns. They are signals of a civilization approaching limits it does not fully understand. What makes this moment different from those that may have preceded it is not wisdom, but visibility. We can see stress accumulating across interconnected systems. We can model feedback loops. We can trace consequences across scales. The warning signs are not hidden in myth or symbol alone. They are quantified, graphed, projected. And yet, knowledge does not automatically produce action. Previous civilizations may also have recognized instability. They may have sensed imbalance in climate, in resources, in social cohesion. Awareness does not guarantee response. Often, it produces hesitation. Change threatens existing power structures. Adaptation disrupts comfort. Delay feels safer than transformation. This hesitation is perhaps the most consistent feature of collapse. Not ignorance, but postponement. The belief that adjustment can wait one more cycle, one more generation, one more innovation. In this sense, the return of forgotten patterns is not about ancient technologies resurfacing. It is about ancient dilemmas repeating. Growth versus restraint. Expansion versus balance. Control versus adaptation. These tensions appear whenever complexity increases faster than resilience. What is returning now is not memory in the traditional sense. It is recognition. A growing intuition that progress without reflection accelerates fragility. That efficiency optimized for short-term gain undermines long-term stability. That systems designed for constant expansion struggle to cope with disruption. These insights echo principles found in ancient philosophies and ecological thinking, now re-emerging through modern science. Sustainability, equilibrium, limits. Concepts once dismissed as pessimistic are being reframed as realistic, not because the past is romanticized, but because the present demands it. This re-emergence suggests that civilizations may rediscover similar truths near their peaks, not because they remember the past, but because they encounter the same constraints. The Earth does not change its rules. Energy remains finite. Ecosystems remain interdependent. Complexity remains brittle when overextended. If earlier civilizations reached similar points of recognition, their failure was not inevitable, it was conditional, dependent on whether awareness translated into structural change, whether memory altered behavior or remained abstract. This is the critical difference between knowing and remembering. Knowing is informational. Remembering is embodied. It shapes decisions, priorities, design. It influences what is valued and what is protected. Modern civilization excels at knowing. It struggles with remembering. We store data externally. We outsource memory to systems that require constant maintenance. We preserve information, but not necessarily meaning. If those systems fail, what remains may be fragments without context, much like the remnants we study from the past. This realization raises an unsettling parallel. We may be creating the same conditions that obscured previous civilizations from view. Complexity layered upon fragility, knowledge centralized and abstracted, memory dependent on continuity rather than resilience. And yet, there is still time to choose differently. Choice does not mean abandoning technology or retreating into nostalgia. It means designing with collapse in mind, prioritizing redundancy over optimization, teaching adaptability alongside innovation, preserving knowledge in forms that can survive disruption, not just efficiency. It also means resisting the urge to believe that awareness alone is sufficient. Many civilizations likely became aware of their limits shortly before exceeding them. The difference lies in whether awareness produces humility or defensiveness. If we are indeed part of a recurring pattern, then this moment, The moment of recognition may be the narrowest and most consequential, a threshold where continuation and repetition diverge briefly. The past does not tell us what will happen. It tells us what has happened when similar conditions arose. It offers context, not prophecy. Ignoring that context does not free us from it. It merely ensures repetition. Perhaps this is why echoes feel louder now, why ancient warnings resonate more clearly, why forgotten patterns return not as answers, but as questions demanding attention. What would it mean to build a civilization that assumes impermanence, that plans for disruption rather than denying it, that treats memory as infrastructure rather than ornament? These are not questions with immediate solutions, they are orientations. They shape direction rather than destination. If earlier civilizations failed to sustain this orientation, it does not mean we must follow, but it does mean the margin for complacency is thin. The quiet truth emerging at this stage of the journey is not that collapse is unavoidable, but that denial accelerates it. That forgetting is easy, remembering is difficult, and difficulty is often avoided until it becomes unavoidable. If this is the seventh civilization, then its defining feature may not be how advanced it becomes, but whether it recognizes the pattern soon enough to step aside from it, even slightly. History does not require perfection to change course. It requires awareness paired with restraint, memory paired with action. Whether we are capable of that pairing remains uncertain, but uncertainty, unlike denial, leaves room for choice. And that room, however narrow, may be the only thing that truly separates us from those who came before. In the end, the most unsettling realization is not that civilizations may rise and fall in cycles, but that the cycle itself is quiet. It does not announce its turning. It does not feel dramatic while it is happening. From the inside, it feels like continuity, like normal life unfolding day by day, like progress. This is perhaps why collapse is so rarely recognized in advance. It does not arrive as an event, but as a series of small, reasonable decisions. Adjustments made for efficiency, compromises justified by urgency, short-term solutions layered atop long-term fragility. Each step makes sense in isolation. Together, they shape a trajectory that feels irreversible only after it has passed a point of balance. Looking backward, we tend to imagine endings as obvious: floods, fires, sudden darkness. But those images are the final frames, not the process. Before them were years of adaptation, normalization, and denial. Before them were moments when warning signs were visible but ambiguous, when alternative paths existed but felt inconvenient. If previous civilizations reached similar thresholds, their silence is understandable. They did not experience collapse as a story with an ending. They experienced it as life becoming harder, systems becoming brittle, memory becoming fragmented. Only later, when survivors looked back, did the shape of an ending emerge. This reframes the idea of evidence being erased. Perhaps much of it was never erased intentionally. Perhaps it dissolved during the long, uneven descent that precedes every major break. Records neglected, knowledge narrowed, attention diverted towards survival. Over time, what was lost no longer felt missing. When we search for proof of earlier worlds, we often look for grand ruins or definitive artifacts. But civilizations do not vanish all at once. They thin, they unravel, they lose coherence before they lose population. What remains may not look like evidence of greatness. It may look like scattered fragments that resist easy interpretation. And so the past appears smaller than it was. The possibility that we are living after many forgotten worlds is unsettling, not because it diminishes us, but because it removes our sense of finality. It suggests that history does not converge toward a stable endpoint. It oscillates, it experiments, it repeats variations on a theme. Within that repetition, however, there is difference. No two cycles are identical. Conditions shift, contexts change, awareness accumulates unevenly. Even forgetting is never complete. Something always leaks through. Patterns, symbols, intuitions, warnings that feel strangely familiar. Perhaps this leakage is the quiet gift of those who came before. Not a message written clearly, but a pressure felt faintly. A sense that something matters more than speed. That balance matters more than expansion. That memory matters more than certainty. These insights do not arrive as instructions. They arrive as unease. as questions that refuse to settle, as the feeling that the ground beneath confidence is less solid than it appears. If we are the seventh civilization, then the number itself is less important than the moment. A moment when enough fragments align to suggest a pattern. A moment when denial becomes harder to maintain than doubt. A moment when remembering, even imperfectly, becomes possible. What happens next is not predetermined. Cycles describe tendencies, not obligations. They show what has happened, not what must happen. But tendencies exert pressure, and resisting pressure requires intention. The past does not demand reverence, it demands attention. Not to monuments or myths alone, but to the conditions that shaped them, to the incentives that drove expansion, to the blind spots that accompanied confidence, to the small decisions that accumulated into irreversible momentum. There is no guarantee that awareness will change outcome. Many civilizations likely became aware of their fragility before they fell. Awareness is necessary, but not sufficient. What matters is whether it reshapes values, priorities, and structures. Memory in this sense is not about preserving every detail. It is about preserving orientation, knowing which direction leads toward resilience and which leads toward acceleration. Knowing when to stop, not because resources are exhausted, but because balance is threatened. This kind of memory is difficult to maintain in a world that rewards growth, speed, and novelty. It feels counterintuitive. It feels restrictive. It asks for restraint when expansion feels possible. It asks for humility when success feels deserved. And yet, if earlier civilizations failed to cultivate this memory, their absence may be its own lesson. Not a condemnation, but a reminder that intelligence without reflection tends to repeat itself. As this journey closes, there is no conclusion to offer, no definitive claim to defend, only a landscape of possibility shaped by fragments, patterns, and silences. A sense that the story of humanity is longer, stranger, and more fragile than we are usually taught. If evidence was nearly erased, it may not be because someone hid it perfectly, but because forgetting is easier than remembering, and repetition feels like progress until it doesn't. Perhaps the most honest position is not certainty, but attentiveness. To watch patterns rather than dismiss them. To hold questions open rather than close them prematurely. To accept that the present is not a destination, but a phase. In that acceptance, something shifts. The future becomes less about conquering uncertainty, and more about living with it. Less about permanence, and more about continuity through change. If civilizations are stories the Earth tells through us, then each one has a chance to listen while it is being written. Not to rewrite the past, but to notice its rhythm. And maybe, just maybe, that noticing, quiet, uneasy, unresolved, is the one thing that has the potential to change how the cycle turns next time.